Okay, so let me talk about how to quantify rent control. So all of us have been talking today about the different effects of rent control, and in order to both decide and undecide, and in order to measure such effect, we need often quantitative measures of rent control, not simply descriptive ones. Therefore, we need some so these quantitative measures can be used as an input for statistical models that could analyze the impact of rent control on a large variety of economic and social variables, such as housing construction, for example, or rents themselves, or even income inequality. So the idea of this presentation, or of the project which underlies this presentation, is to extract quantitative information from the legal texts. So legal texts, all of us probably to some extent have seen these legal texts and tried to read them. They are written in quite a difficult to understand legal language, but they contain very useful information that we want to try to extract and to represent in quantitative terms. So is it possible at all? The answer is yes. In fact, we have a body of literature which is called leximetrics. That means measuring laws. And this literature has been very active not only in the field of housing policy, but also with respect to labor legislation, protection of shareholders, financial regulations. In terms of housing policy, we have quite a bit of studies. The first one that I could identify was of Stephen Malpezzi, who is hopefully still with us in this presentation. And what it did, it quantified rent control in 51 market economies. Since then, other studies were published, but the main feature of these studies was that they were using a cross-section approach. It means that they covered many countries from 30 to 116, but all of them taken in one single year. And we know that in order to analyze the effects of rent control, we have to take into account the past. Why? Because housing market is some durable phenomenon. So the housing stock that we have now has been built to a large extent 20, 50, 30 years ago. Therefore, it was shaped by regulations adopted 20, 50 years ago. So we need not only the cross-sectional, not only the spatial dimension, but also the temporal dimension. And the first study to realize and to implement this was that of Alexander Miletic, who is also present here, who produced a panel of countries and years, namely 4 South and Eastern European countries in the first decade after World War I. And in addition, he, along with considering the intensity of rent control, he considered also eviction protection and housing rationing. 1 year later, Jan Philipp Weber came up with a comprehensive methodology of measuring rent control and eviction protection. He did it for 18 countries and more than 40 years. What I did was to extend the approach of Jan Philipp Weber, both in terms of number of countries covered. So now in my most recent paper on this, I have more than 100 countries and more than 100 years. And I also extended this database by including another dimension of regulations, namely housing rationing. Nationalization is one example of this housing rationing. So let us look at how to measure rent control. So from now on, I will only focus on the rent control. This is the approach suggested by Jan Philipp Weber. He identifies in the whole complex policy of rent control, he identifies 7 elements. And then for each element, he constructs a binary variable. That is the variable that takes either value 0 or 1. For example, for the first variable, which is the rent control level, rent level control, which means basically that the rent is set not by a free negotiation between tenant and landlord, but by some governmental body or courts. As today we heard about New York, those were courts who determined the rent level, or in some cases arbitration councils. If this is so, then in this particular year we write 1, otherwise 0. As a result, we get a sequence of numbers, zeros and ones, say for 110 years, where in the periods where rent level control existed, we have ones, otherwise we have zeros. Another dimension of rent control is nominal freeze. This is the situation when the government or court fixes the rent in nominal terms, in terms of money. For example, we saw in the presentation of Sophie that under Mietendeckel, the regulation rent freeze, Berlin's rent freeze, the rents were fixed at 4 to 10 euros per square meter per month, which means that they are nominally fixed. So when other prices go up, the nominal rents remain the same, but the real rents erode. This is, by the way, typical for the rent control policy, which we also seen in the presentation of Aurora. Another dimension of rent control is real freeze. So in this case, we don't impose limitations on the level of rents, but we allow them to increase, but under the condition that their growth rate doesn't exceed the growth rate of the cost of living measure, of some cost of living measure, for example, consumer price index. If it's so, then the index is equal to 1, otherwise it's equal to 0. Well, the remaining three variables refer to different exceptions from the general rule. For example, intertenancy to control, this is typical for the US. When the tenant leaves the regulated dwelling, the dwelling stops being regulated. If it's so, then the index is equal to 0, otherwise it's equal to 1. So the general rule here is that the stricter the regulation, the less exceptions from regulation, from rent control it has, the higher should be the index. The sixth variable refers to exceptions for new and luxury dwellings. Again, we've seen an example of this for Australia, for Italy and for New York. So in this case, if there's such exception, we set the index to be equal to 0, otherwise to 1. And then we may have stricter controls for certain areas. For example, in Germany, Catalonia, and France, we have nowadays restrictions that apply only to areas with tight housing market, or to some categories of households, for example, only low-income households, or some categories of landlords, like in the project of the law to be adopted in Spain sometime in the future. They are going to apply rent control only to big landlords, so not to smaller ones. In the end of the day, we obtain 6 binary indices, and for each year, we compute a simple average of them, which gives us the overall intensity of rent control. And that's a measure I'm going to work with in what follows. So currently, the data set encompasses 133 countries and states. States, because in some countries, these rent control regulations are adopted regionally. So not only at the national level, but more importantly at the regional level. Examples include Australia, Canada, India, Pakistan, Mexico, US, of course, too, but due to the sheer number of states here, I just decided for the time being to construct an overall national index. So now let us see at the evolution of the intensity of rent control over the years. So what we see here are these 133 countries and states. The color is white because at the beginning of the sample, namely in 1910, none of these countries had rent control. Black country corresponds to a total or first generation rent control. And the shades of gray correspond to varying degrees of the intensity of rent control. So I start timeline, and we see that gradually more and more countries introduced rent control, especially during World War I. Then deregulation follows, but with the beginning of the World War II, we have a new wave of deregulations. The war is over, so a new phase, but very slow phase of deregulation starts. And then in the early 70s, we have again a wave of regulation connected to the oil shocks and hyperinflation of that period. And then in the early 90s, many or most former socialist countries dismantled completely their rent controls. And since 2010, we come to a second phase of regulation, especially in Europe, in such countries as Germany, France, and Spain, where strict rent control laws are introduced. So even before the pandemic came, we had many countries had rent control. I should say that actually it's impossible to find any country which didn't have rent control over the last 110 years. So all of them had some form of rent control. And on the eve of the pandemic, there were still many countries having first generation of rent control and some countries with the second generation rent control. And then pandemic came. So what happened to the housing market? The pandemic caused an economic crisis, and this of course implied that the disposable incomes of households reduced, which in turn implies two problems for the households. So on the one hand, if you have less income, you sometimes cannot pay your rent, and the non-payment of rent is the most important reason for being evicted from the house. So you are in a strange situation. The government wants you to stay at home, and you are kicked out of your home because you cannot pay the rent. Another risk is that if you still manage to pay the rent, you cannot afford spending your money on other things because your income reduced and you pay the rent. So much less money is left for other expenses, such as, for example, food. Therefore, the government decided, in many countries, decided to support both tenants and homeowners, I must say. Here we will focus just on two policies here, namely on eviction bans and rent control. You can see here, I cannot guarantee that this is a complete picture, although I tried to analyze as many countries as possible. But at least 52 countries had, during pandemic, some form of eviction ban. In addition, 24 countries had introduced or planned to introduce. Green color means that they were planning, but it's not clear whether they introduced it or not. So over 20 countries introduced some form of rent control. Some countries, this is the shorter bar, introduced simply a rent freeze, like the one we were talking about in Berlin. Okay, in Berlin, Mietendeckel was not related to the pandemic, but at least that's the same type of rent control. There were several countries that even reduced rents. For example, in Spain and Greece, the rents were reduced by 40–50%. And there were several countries like Venezuela, Oman, Nepal, and Gabon that completely phased out rent payments during the pandemic, during the emergency period. Well, in some countries, the controls are no longer in place. They were active just for several months, but in many other countries, these controls still are in place. For example, in Ireland and Spain, they still have these emergency policies because the emergency period is supposed to continue. More important even is that these temporary interim policies, and here I can refer to the title of Aurora's presentation. These interim policies, they can easily turn into permanent ones. And that we see, for example, in Ireland, where these temporary measures led to reform of rent control legislation overall. And we see this also in Spain with their plans to introduce next year a national level rent control. So we are in the middle of very interesting events, and it's very interesting to analyze what is happening, and it will be even more interesting to see what kind of effects it will have on the whole society and on the economy. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll be glad to answer your questions, if any. And another thing is I would like to invite you to contribute to this database on rent control legislation that is constantly being expanded and updated, because I think it would be it's a nice source of data for analysis on the effects of rent control. Thanks a lot. Well, Sebastian has a question.
Yeah, thank you, Konstantin. I share your enthusiasm for these data collections, as you know. One question is like going beyond the descriptive analysis. Like, have you run some regressions on why countries differed in their COVID rent regulation approaches? I mean, is it the liberal welfare states who needed it? Is it, affect like how much they were affected just by the pandemic?
I tried to do it, but still the results are very preliminary. Therefore, I wouldn't like to discuss them. It's even more interesting to do such thing for the US, because they have more homogeneous sample. I mean, for the states, for the single states, and these states, they, despite existing national policy that was commented upon by Dennis, each state had also its own rent control or eviction bans. And there you can see the variation, for example, in terms of the partisanship of the governor of the state and things like this. Yeah. Andrei?
Yeah, thank you, Konstantin, for this impressive presentation and work. My question is about the COVID graphic. You analyzed the legislations only and not how this legislations work. So, for example, if you mark Germany as an anti-eviction ban state, on the other hand, the government published data so that more than 30,000 evictions were happened in 2020. So that did you plan to prove how this legislations work in practice?
Yeah, it would be, of course, an interesting exercise to see, and that has to do with, yeah. That's the opposite side of the question that Sebastian just asked. Yeah, the thing is that, and I have, by the way, a link to this public. It's not a publication. It's just that I made it available online. So this the results on pandemic regulations, and we plan, by the way, to send you the slides. And in my slides, you can click on the title of a particular slide and go to the corresponding link. So there I show some results for some countries. For example, for the US, we have, fortunately for the US, lots of data concerning the dynamics of evictions, whether the number of evictions reduced in a particular city due to the eviction ban, or what happened to for example, to non-payment of rents. These are the data collected by Bureau of Census, I think. And these are very detailed data, so you can get them even at the micro level, so at the level of particular households. The thing is that not all countries are that good in terms of data. For example, for Germany is considered to be a tenant state, but somehow the availability of data on rental market, which is quantitatively more important than the home ownership market, is very poor, I should say. I mean, the eviction data, we only get them from from associations of tenants, and those data refer to the previous year. So in order to get data for this year, we have to wait until 2022, and that's a pity, I should say. Yeah, Christoph, please.
Yes, I would say thank you to all participants first. Then I was sort of confused about the use of first, second, and third generation rent control. I mean, that we would need a clear definition there. In particular, Mietpreisbremse applies to new contracts only. And so, and Andre used the term third generation, which is not clear to me either. And one final argument is, which has not been considered, I think the enormous polarization tough rent control measures entail, and they have become visible even in our first session. You know what I mean, no? So I think that, yeah, this should also be introduced in a general assessment, that that it leads to an extreme polarization of society, because it's really difficult to accept, because the reach will not be equal to all owners. Some owners are able to circumvent it, others not. Some are in cities where no rent control applies, as Sophie has shown that the demand and rents in near Berlin Brandenburg increased. So it has huge distortive and unequal effects. And yeah, so my plea would be to take on board in the analysis also these polarizing effects for society. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Christoph. Linus?
Yeah, thank you. My question is about, as we all know, the enforcement and the legislation can differ a lot. And from my own research to the regulation of short-term rentals, it actually does differ a lot. So my question is to you and to everybody, maybe if there are some kind of ways to measure also enforcement of rental regulation and not only the legislation on paper.
Yeah, well, one of the papers I cited, I think, no, I excluded it, but because it was not about rent control, but rather about courts. So there are attempts, at least, to measure the enforcement of these regulations, to measure the effectiveness of courts in general, and to measure how effective is the enforcement. And you're completely right. I mean, in many countries, and there are surveys that show, for example, in some African or South American countries that have the first generation, well, Christoph doesn't like it, rent freezes. So the majority of people, 95% of tenants, do not even know that they are protected by this rent control legislation. And it means that they are, of course, not enforced. Plus, you have also a large informal sector where its existence is already under big question. So in this sector, you don't have any form of rent control. You don't have any form of control at all. So plus, there might be a difficulty with measuring the enforcement, although it should be it is a very important question, a very relevant question. And here I mean how to measure the enforcement, say 20 or 50 or 100 years ago. I mean, nowadays you can at least ask the lawyers, ask the courts on how effective this legislation being implemented, but what about 20 years ago, 50 years ago? Who should possess this information and share it? So here I see some issues with availability of the data. But this doesn't mean that we shouldn't measure this enforcement, at least nowadays. That would provide lots of useful information. Okay, so thanks a lot for your questions. We are at the end of the first day, and it was very fruitful, I think. So tomorrow we will continue. We'll start at the same time. We'll have only one session, and after that session we'll have a round table. And I would really appreciate if you could at least try to come to this round table, because today we left very little time for discussions, and this round table could be a beautiful opportunity for all of us to share our ideas. And I see that the views are quite different here, but nevertheless it can be or maybe even because of this can be a very lively, vivid discussion tomorrow. So I would really be happy if you could come tomorrow and take part in this roundtable. Thanks a lot, and see you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
Thanks, see you.
Thanks. Have a nice evening. See